The Hawker Siddeley Trident was perhaps one of the most advanced jet airliners of its day, but ultimately was an aircraft nobody wanted, as even though it pioneered many successful technological design elements, it was the highly stringent specifications required by main customer British European Airways, or BEA, that eventually saw the Trident fail against its close rival, the Boeing 727. The reasons behind the Trident came due to BEA's initial avoidance of jet-powered flight, instead focusing their core development on the use of highly successful turboprops like the Vickers Viscount. But while the Viscount was economical, swift, comfortable and efficient, the airline was acutely aware that the rise in jet aviation was an inevitability that couldn't be ignored. It was only after BEA had put out a tender for a 100-seat turboprop airliner for their medium-haul services across Europe, which would eventually result in the Vickers Vanguard, that they began to observe the success of the Sud Aviation Carvel, the world's first regional jet airliner, which undertook its maiden flight in mid-1955, and therefore the carrier decided that a short-range jet had to be built in order to remain competitive. In July 1956, shortly after outlining specifications for the Vanguard, BEA stated its interest for a short-haul second-generation jet airliner that would supplement their vast turboprop fleet. This aircraft, designed to carry 20,000 pounds of cargo or 70 passengers, use 6,000 feet of runway, cruise at between 610 and 620 miles an hour, and have more than 2 engines, the general mentality behind such a jet being to outperform the Carvel wherever possible. But while no formal tender process had actually been filed by BEA, Britain's aircraft manufacturers took it upon themselves regardless to design an airliner to their specifications. In total, 4 airliners emerged as potential contenders: the Bristol Type 200, a 4-engine jet airliner, the Avro 740 Trijet, the Vickers VC-11, a regional variant of the company's upcoming VC-10 long-range airliner, and the de Havilland DH-121 Trijet. But in August 1957, the requirements for the airliner changed to increase the seating capacity to 98 passengers, and that the aircraft would be fitted with brand new Rolls-Royce Medway engines. Of the 4 designs, the DH-121 had the greatest merits, as, being the world's first trijet airliner, it offered a perfect compromise between cruising economy and takeoff safety in case of an engine failure, while also satisfying BEA's requirement for an aircraft with more than 2 engines, each of these power plants driving its own hydraulic system as a form of redundancy against system failures, and would provide 13,790 pounds of thrust, giving the DH-121 a range of 2,070 miles, and the ability to carry between 111 and 140 passengers, with the original tail design, similar to that of the Carvel, being altered to a T-tail arrangement due to the 3rd engine. Performance-wise, the DH-121 was able to descend at a rate that far exceeded its contemporaries, often up to 4,500 feet per minute in regular service, with an emergency descent rate of up to 10,000 feet a minute, which would be permissible through the use of reverse thrust, and while below 280 knots, it was also possible to extend the main landing gear for use as an air brake, as well as early versions of the production model, even featuring the unusual capability of engaging reverse thrust prior to touchdown, the throttles being closed in the flare, and reverse idle set to open the reverser buckets. The biggest party piece of the DH-121, however, was its complex but sophisticated avionics systems, the most famous of all being the automatic blind landing system developed by Hawker Siddeley and Smith's Aircraft Instruments, this system having been developed in order to solve a major issue of fog at both London Heathrow and other British airports. The DH-121's advanced avionics displayed the aircraft's momentary position relative to the ground on a moving map mounted in the centre instrument panel, while positional information was given by a Doppler navigation system that read ground speed and drift data, which, alongside heading data, drove the stylus, and with this ability, the DH-121 could operate safely to airfields equipped with suitable ILS installations, regardless of weather, while other aircraft were forced to divert. The physical dimensions of most avionics of the period required them to be housed in a large compartment beneath the Trident's flight deck, and thus the nose landing gear of the aircraft was offset by 2 feet to the port side and retracted sideways to stow across the DH-121's longitudinal axis. Impressed by the DH-121's remarkable specifications, BEA took it forward for further considerations, but delays were soon incurred due to the quickly changing government policies on aircraft design, with BEA, as an arm of the government, suffering heavily from this indecision, and any changes to policy meant that discussions and concepts had to go back to the very beginning with each instance, compounded further in the late 1950s by the government's shift in view on aircraft manufacturers and aero-engine builders, preferring instead to merge as many of these companies as possible into one large organisation. De Havilland wanted to avoid a merger, as they feared the lucrative DH-121 contract would be handed over to whichever company they were forced to join with. Therefore, they approached the government with a proposal to have the aircraft's production outsourced across various rival firms, with fuselages built by de Havilland, while Bristol would create the wings, and various other companies, including Hunting Aircraft and Fairey Aviation, manufacturing other elements. But Bristol refused to play second fiddle to de Havilland, and instead chose to work in conjunction with Hawker Siddeley in order to defeat the DH-121. The DH-121 project, however, was able to garner the interest of Hunting and Fairey, who couldn't resist being part of a £30 million contract with the potential for widespread foreign sales, and thus on February 4, 1958, Hunting, Fairey and de Havilland merged together and formed Airco, the name of Geoffrey de Havilland's original employer in World War I. While this was occurring, Bristol and Hawker Siddeley joined forces and went about merging aspects of their proposed airliner in order to beat out the DH-121, and in January 1958, both design teams were allowed the honour to meet with Pan American World Airways of the United States and present proposals for possible interest. But this move proved to be their undoing, as, just prior to their meeting with Pan Am, Bristol asked BEA for the development to be delayed until such time that export orders could be confirmed, to which BEA responded by immediately giving approval to the DH-121, killing the Bristol Type 200. Regardless, discussions with the American carriers would likely have been fruitless in any event, as in early 1959, after 3 years of development and market research, Boeing put forward a concept for America's first domestic jet airliner, the Boeing 727 Trijet, which answered the call of airlines which wanted to introduce jet-powered flight to smaller airports, but were unable to do so due to the size of their pioneering Boeing 707. In response to the Boeing 727's announcement, Airco decided it might be mutually beneficial to both the Americans and the British if the 727 was dropped in favour of allowing license-built export versions of the DH-121 in the United States, and so, with the backing of BEA, Boeing designers were invited to the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, and Airco designers were invited to the Boeing factory in Renton. This exchange, however, proved to be an incredibly one-sided case of information sharing, as in America, the Boeing team were aloof and didn't divulge too many details regarding the 727's design to the British team, while in Britain, the Airco team laid out all their cards and described to the Boeing representatives every detail of their concept, from the tail structure to the avionics and engines, meaning that Boeing designers flew home to Seattle with all of their rivals' secrets under their belts. Needless to say, the Boeing de Havilland potential tie-up never materialised, and on February 12, 1958, the British government authorised BEA to open negotiations for an order of 24 brand new jet aircraft, of which BEA chose the DH-121, once again putting the carrier at odds with the government, as for reasons of political convenience, they preferred the Bristol Type 200. But when the airline proposed employing caravels as an interim measure, Parliament was forced to relent, as de Havilland's prior work in building the pioneering Comet, despite its safety record, put them in the best position to develop what was now dubbed the Trident. By April 1958, de Havilland had generally reached a consensus on how the Trident would be built, with its maiden flight proposed for mid-1961, while also expecting at least 550 units to have been built and sold by 1965, with changes to the Trident including the widening of the fuselage to fit 6 abreast seating in order to accommodate more economy-class passengers. Aviation observers confident that the airliner would easily replicate the phenomenal success of the Viscount in winning over both the domestic and international markets. However, in March 1959, BEA got cold feet with regard to the decline in passenger growth, and demanded that de Havilland reduce the payload of the aircraft in order to reflect this downturn so as to not make a loss on empty seats. BEA's worries being founded on 3 factors: the effects of the 1958 Eisenhower recession and subsequent downturn in passenger traffic, the Trident presenting capacity and range nearly identical to the Vickers Vanguard, and a growing trend for higher density seating. While de Havilland concurred, there was an overarching fear that, much like the Comet and the Bristol Britannia, the company was building a highly advanced airliner exclusively for just one airline, rather than having the universal appeal of Boeing's products and the Vickers Viscount, this debate putting the Trident on the stumbling block, while Bristol continued to promote their smaller Type 200, just as both of America's upcoming regional jets, the 727 and the Douglas DC-9, were also downsized to reflect the market trend. Relenting, de Havilland cut down the size of the Trident, as well as changing the proposed power plant from the Medway engines to the smaller Rolls-Royce Spey engines of the Blackburn Buccaneer fighter. The Spey, while a formidable power plant, demonstrating a 40% lower power output than that of the Medway, and reducing the range of the Trident by 930 miles. Meanwhile, complex changes had to be made to the fuselage in order to lower the capacity, which eventually gave the Trident a total seating of between 75 and 97 passengers, while the wingspan was also reduced by approximately 17 feet, and the wing area contracted by 30%, although in order to maintain its proposed 6 abreast seating capacity, the diameter of the fuselage remained unchanged. With the downsized aircraft now generally agreed on, BEA placed an order for 24 Tridents and an additional 12 options on August 24, 1959, the details of the aircraft's revolutionary avionics being made public in early 1960, followed by the official announcement of the Trident name at the Farnborough Air Show in September of that year. 1960 also saw things come full circle with regard to the rivalry between de Havilland and Hawker Siddeley over BEA's prospective airliner, as having lucked out on supporting the Bristol Type 200, Hawker Siddeley were allowed a second opportunity to win the prize when de Havilland descended into financial anarchy following years of sustained losses on the Comet project, and with nowhere else to turn, Hawker Siddeley purchased the ailing firm and disbanded the Airco group, with Hunting being sold off to the newly founded British Aircraft Corporation or BAC, while Ferry Aviation was incorporated into Westland. But Hawker Siddeley's decision to sell Hunting, however, was perhaps its biggest blunder, as it removed any possibility of the company cashing in on Hunting's 107 regional airliner, later to become the BAC 111, one of the best-selling British airliners of all time. Instead, what resulted was a deformed and downgraded Trident, caused by the constant reorganisation of the British aircraft manufacturing industry by the government, with such delays and complications, meaning that the proposed maiden flight of the airliner would not be in mid-1961 as originally planned, allowing the much more stable production of the Boeing 727 to catch up. The streamlined design process of the American competitor meant it was able to whittle away many of the Trident's prospective orders, the most famous example being in Australia, where Trans-Australia Airlines, who had ordered the Trident, chose to exchange it for the 727 due to rivals Ansett Australia selecting the latter, while, at the time of de Havilland's absorption into Hawker Siddeley, discussions with American Airlines to buy the Trident were opened in order to try and get the airliner sold in the United States, but the American carrier stated its preference for an aircraft that had improved range and capacity for trunk routes operating between the nation's major urban centres, dimensions which exactly matched the original specifications of the DH-121 that BEA had sheepishly ordered downsized, thus losing out to the Boeing 727. Eventually, after a turbulent development period, the Trident prototype took to the skies for the first time on January 9, 1962, and following a period of further testing, the airliner entered service with BEA on April 1, 1964, with 15 Tridents in operation with the carrier by the end of the year. However, as the complicated Trident struggled to make its way out of the factory in 1964, the Boeing 727 had been in operation for nearly 2 months, and Hawker Siddeley struggled to keep up with demand, Boeing's Renton factory having been pushed to maximum capacity in order to deliver both the 707 and 727 to prospective customers, while the Trident suffered mediocre sales, supported only by a few domestic orders and interest from Middle Eastern carriers. Perhaps the most distinguishing orders came from the Civil Aviation Administration of China, or CAAC, the national carrier of the communist nation, who, despite being at the height of the infamous Cultural Revolution, wherein the politically isolated nation focused itself on restoring the principles of communist ideals through the purging of Western culture and technology, took on 38 Tridents, 3 of which were second-hand from Pakistan International Airlines, and operated them extensively across the vast Chinese nation. From the original Trident 1C came the Trident 1E, which increased the capacity, uprated the Spey engines, and provided additional leading-edge slats for better low-speed performance, followed by the Trident 2E, which took the 1E and fitted it with the pioneering Autoland system, and will go on to become the most popular variant of the Trident family, complemented later by the addition of the 3B, which took the 2E and increased its length by 16 feet, while also adding a Rolls-Royce RB162 booster engine for better takeoff performance, essentially making it a quad-engined airliner. Come the end of the 1960s, though, BEA, in the face of the Trident's incredible complexity and expensive operation, was proposing the introduction of American alternatives such as the newly launched Boeing 737, while Hawker Siddeley, on the other hand, wanted to evolve the Trident from a tri-jet configuration to a twin-jet called the HS-134, its dimensions not too dissimilar to that of the modern Boeing 757. Sadly, as a compromise, BEA was strong-armed by the government into buying the Trident 3B, while Hawker Siddeley were told to rationalise on costs by simply taking the Trident 3B and extending the range by 430 miles, this slightly modified version of the Trident resulting in the Super 3B, of which only 2 units were built as prospective buyers failed to appear. Finally, production of the Trident petered out in 1978, with only 117 units produced, while in comparison, Boeing had produced 1,832 Boeing 727s by the time production of that airliner ended in 1984, when it was replaced by the Boeing 757 twinjet. Tridents would continue in service with British Airways until 1985, being taken briefly out of service in 1977, when fatigue cracks were discovered in the wings of their fleet, and thus emergency repairs had to be made by Hawker Siddeley, until eventual noise mitigation regulations drafted in the early 1980s meant that rather than fitting the aircraft with hush kits, they were gradually replaced by Boeing 757s until the last units were retired, while CAAC would have the distinction of being the last operator of the Trident, continuing to work their fleet on its gigantic regional network until 1995, when they were replaced by Boeing 737s. In terms of accidents, the Trident was a very safe airliner, only suffering 7 fatal crashes with a total of 357 deaths, the first accident being on June 3, 1966, when a Trident 1C, while on an early test flight from Hatfield, entered an unrecoverable deep stall after the crew failed to undertake prompt and decisive recovery action, resulting in 4 deaths. On September 13, 1971, a CAAC Trident was lost over Mongolia due to what was reported as fuel starvation, but conspiracy theories resonate as to this accident, as aboard the airliner was former Minister of National Defense of the People's Republic of China, Lin Biao, who had reportedly fallen out of favor with the Chinese Premier, Chairman Mao, and, following an unsuccessful attempted coup, Biao was forced to flee to the Soviet Union aboard the pre-arranged Trident, leading to speculation of sabotage or shoot-down by members of the Maoist government. On June 18, 1972, BEA Flight 548, climbing away from Heathrow Airport, entered a deep stall and crashed shortly after takeoff near Staines due to pilot error, killing all 118 passengers and crew aboard in what was the worst non-terrorist aircraft accident in British history. On September 10, 1976, an error by air traffic controllers sent British Airways Flight 476 colliding in mid-air with Inex Adria Flight 550, a Douglas DC-9, over Zagreb, Yugoslavia, killing a total of 176 passengers and making it the deadliest airliner accident in both the history of Yugoslavia and Croatia. The final accident, involving a Hawker Siddeley Trident, occurred on August 31, 1988, when during poor weather, CAAC Flight 301 struck the approach lights as it landed on runway 31 of Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport, before landing short and striking the sea wall, tearing off the landing gear and causing the jet to tumble into the harbour, killing a total of 7 people. In the end, the Trident, despite its many endearing features, would be but a sideshow of aviation history, seldom remembered and barely recognised for its innovation, while the Boeing 727 continues to see regular freight operation across the globe. Hawker Siddeley's superbly advanced trijet, one that was meant to conquer the world's regional jet market, now seeing out its future in the quiet life of scattered museum pieces, a far cry from what was originally envisaged.